Mrs. Puff owns a school, operates equipment like boats and simulators, and keeps the whole operation running despite SpongeBob failing so spectacularly that it feels almost intentional. Could SpongeBob's failures actually be padding her pockets, or is she losing money every time he crashes into a building?
Oh, SpongeBob! Why?
And let's not forget her murky past. Mrs. Puff isn't just a stressed-out teacher. She's got a criminal record, fines, lawsuits, and even jail time. This woman has seen it all. So how does she afford to keep going? I'm gonna start with what we exactly know about her. Her life looks simple on the surface. She's a driving instructor. She owns a school, she shows up every day just like we do at our regular jobs, but unlike us, she keeps failing SpongeBob whenever he tries to attempt passing his driving test, except for one time, when she actually passed him. We will get to that part later in the video. And she wears the same outfit every day. She's always wearing that sailor-inspired dress with the red trim and matching hat. Practical? Yes, but also suspiciously consistent. I mean, no one's closet is that predictable. Turns out you can buy a Mrs. Puff cosplay costume online for $70.46. Now, let's say she owns a dozen of those for a rotation. She's already spent over $800 on wardrobe alone, but hey, at least she doesn't waste money on accessories. Her work environment is modest but functional. The boating school is a single-room classroom with a dock outside for practical lessons. Simple, but it's a lot more complicated than that. For starters, let's talk about insurance. Running a driving, or in this case, boating school is a liability nightmare. Every crash, every sunken boat, every SpongeBob-induced catastrophe, that's a claim waiting to happen. A real-world driving school would pay thousands of dollars annually for liability coverage. And with SpongeBob in the mix, you've got to imagine her premiums are through the roof. How does she even get coverage? Well, to keep up with those insane premiums, Mrs. Puff needs a steady income, which comes from the boating school. Now, let's talk income. A real-world driving school charges around $50 per lesson. Assuming Mrs. Puff charges something similar and runs 4 lessons a day, 6 days a week, she'd make about $62,400 annually. But SpongeBob has been her student for years, constantly failing, constantly retaking the course. What if he's her bread and butter? If SpongeBob's lessons are extra long, or if she's sneakily charging damage fees, she could be earning even more. But then again, that income could just as easily vanish into repair bills and lawsuits. Now, if he's attending, say, 3 times a week and paying full price every time, Mrs. Puff could be earning an additional $7,800 annually just from him. And let's be honest, there's no way SpongeBob's catastrophic tendencies don't come with hidden fees. Imagine a boat repair surcharge, or a dock damage deposit. If Mrs. Puff is adding even a modest $20 per accident, and we know SpongeBob racks up a lot of those, that's potentially hundreds, if not thousands in extra income each year. But before we get carried away imagining Mrs. Puff swimming in cash, let's shift gears and talk about her expenses, because they are brutal. Running a driving school in real life requires liability insurance, and I have already mentioned Mrs. Puff's premiums are astronomical. With SpongeBob crashing into buildings, sinking boats, and causing general mayhem, her annual insurance costs could easily top $10,000. That's assuming any insurance company in their right mind would even cover her. And what about the equipment? Boats aren't cheap, even underwater. A typical training boat costs anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. And with the rate SpongeBob destroys them, she's likely replacing one every few months. If Mrs. Puff has a fleet of 5 or 6 boats, her initial investment could easily be $15,000 to $20,000. Factor in maintenance, fuel, and SpongeBob's inevitable destruction, and you're looking at an additional $5,000 to $7,000 per year just to keep her fleet operational. And it doesn't stop there. The classroom itself requires upkeep. Maybe this gets covered by the government, but I'm not exactly an expert on the school system of Bikini Bottom to make that call. But if we were to estimate the expenses like buying chalkboards and SpongeBob-sized dents in the walls, Mrs. Puff's repairs and replacements likely cost her a few $1,000s a year. Not to mention utilities, water and electricity aren't free, even in Bikini Bottom. Let's estimate she spends $1,200 annually on those alone. But here's something to think about. What's one thing every criminal needs to stay out of sight? A cover story, and Mrs. Puff's boating school could be the perfect front for her illegal dealings. Think about it, Mrs. Puff has a criminal record, which means she's no stranger to legal fees and fines. Every time she's arrested, and let's be real, it happens more often than you'd expect for a boating instructor, she's potentially racking up hundreds in court costs, bail, and penalties. Over the years, these legal woes could easily total thousands of dollars. Take the No Free Rides episode as an example, where she gave SpongeBob a fake license in a desperate attempt to rid herself of his chaos. In real-world terms, a fake license offense could lead to fines upward of $1,000, not to mention potential court fees of $500 or more. Given her track record, it's likely that these incidents have added up to thousands of dollars over the years. Even her behavior raises questions. She's constantly anxious, hyper-aware, and occasionally downright paranoid. Is it just the stress of teaching SpongeBob, or is she terrified her past might catch up with her? The idea of her school being a front for something more nefarious might actually explain how she's keeping her doors open. But let's put the darker speculation aside for a moment and turn back to the numbers. If Mrs. Puff is struggling financially, how does she stack up to her real-world counterparts? Mrs. Puff might also have other income streams we're not explicitly shown. She could offer weekly defensive driving classes for adult fish. At $150 per session with 5 attendees per week, she'd rake in $750 weekly. Over a year, that adds up to $39,000. This alone could double her primary income, giving her some financial breathing room. She could also capitalize on seasonal demands by running holiday-themed classes. I mean, she might offer winter boating prep sessions during Bikini Bottom's colder months, where she could teach students to navigate icy waters safely. These could attract occasional attendees who don't typically enroll in her standard courses. If each holiday-themed class costs $200 and draws 10 students, she'd earn $2,000 per session. Running just 2 sessions per holiday season would generate $4,000 in extra revenue. But if you are running a boating school, you don't just teach individual students. Mrs. Puff might also have deals with local businesses needing training for their employees. For instance, Bikini Bottom Industries might require their fleet drivers to complete safety courses. If she charges $500 per employee for a corporate training program and trains 20 employees per year, she'd earn $10,000 annually from just one company. Expanding her corporate clientele, say adding 3 more businesses, could multiply her revenue. With 4 companies on board, she'd rake in $40,000 annually. But we aren't going to leave out the shady part of her business, right? I mean, what fun would that be if I was only going to detail how much a driving instructor makes in Bikini Bottom without talking about some dark, controversial theories? With her past full of suspicious activity, it's entirely plausible that the boating school isn't just a legitimate business, but a cover for something far more lucrative and illegal. She's probably hiding money from her criminal past or even laundering funds. This means that her actual financial situation could be far more complex and far more profitable. I mean, the seemingly endless supply of boats might not be due to SpongeBob's incompetence, but because Mrs. Puff is hiding illegal activity in plain sight. The idea is that Mrs. Puff is running an underwater smuggling operation. The chaos of SpongeBob's driving lessons could be the perfect distraction. Boats loaded with contraband are wrecked during lessons, but the goods conveniently make their way to secret drop-offs. If each boat carries items worth $10,000 and she pulls off just 1 successful wreck per month, that's an extra $120,000 annually completely off the books. And maybe Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs are secretly connected. Mrs. Puff is laundering money for the Krusty Krab, using the school's expenses as a cover for suspicious transactions. He's known for his love of money, and Mrs. Puff's school could be the perfect front for laundering cash. Teaming up with Mrs. Puff might allow both of them to profit in ways the rest of Bikini Bottom wouldn't suspect. Let's say she processes $250,000 a year in school expenses, funneling a chunk of that through Mr. Krabs' business. If she takes a 10% cut for facilitating this scheme, she'd pocket $25,000 annually without lifting a fin. Of course, SpongeBob remains a key piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Puff deliberately keeps him enrolled in her school because he's a financial goldmine. His failures mean more lessons, more payments, and more insurance claims. Let's be real, he's probably funded at least $100,000 worth of lessons and repair costs alone. But there's another angle to consider. What if SpongeBob is part of a bigger plan? Maybe Mrs. Puff knows that his clumsy antics keep Bikini Bottom distracted while she carries out her schemes. And she used to be involved with a high-stakes underwater crime syndicate. Her current life as a boating instructor could be her attempt to go legit. However, if her old crew is still active, she might be funneling a cut of her earnings or even assisting in small-scale heists to stay in their good graces. If she's getting paid for her expertise in these operations, she could earn $50,000 annually on top of her legitimate income. But there's another way Mrs. Puff could be using SpongeBob's excellent driving skills to make money. See, in a town like Bikini Bottom, where news spreads fast and chaos is practically a daily occurrence, SpongeBob's driving tests have likely become a major event. His predictable failures, paired with the sheer spectacle of destruction, could easily attract an audience. Enterprising locals might have turned this into a full-fledged underground betting operation. Let's say bettors collectively wager $10,000 per driving test. Mrs. Puff, as the orchestrator, or at least an active participant, might take a 10% house cut for organizing or facilitating the bets. That means $1,000 per test straight into her pocket. If SpongeBob takes 20 tests a year, that's $20,000 in untaxed, under-the-table income annually. And Mrs. Puff's involvement would have to be subtle. Maybe she accidentally leaves test schedules lying around or gives subtle hints about upcoming driving routes, allowing bettors to plan ahead. She might even stage the tests near high-traffic areas to draw more eyes and more bets. The chaos SpongeBob causes provides perfect cover. When a test ends with a fiery crash or SpongeBob plowing through downtown Bikini Bottom, the authorities are too busy dealing with the aftermath to notice a quiet exchange of money among shady bettors in the background. And I know you are probably thinking, does this theory actually hold water? Well, it's not entirely far-fetched. In fact, SpongeBob's failures are so consistent that they could serve as a kind of fixed game, which is precisely the type of event that underground betting thrives on. So after all these theories and estimates, where does she actually land? Well, here are her estimated legitimate earnings. We will start with sources of income. Regular lessons, $62,400 annually. SpongeBob's special lessons, an extra $7,800 annually. Damage fees from SpongeBob, an additional $1,000 annually. Defensive driving courses, $39,000 annually. Holiday-themed classes, $4,000. Employee training deals with local businesses, $40,000. Total income from legit sources, $154,200 annually. But let's not ignore her illegal activities. This is what she is earning from her shady activities. Smuggling operation, $120,000 annually. Money laundering for Mr. Krabs, $25,000 annually. Consulting her underwater heists, $50,000 annually. Total from shady dealings, $195,000 annually. When we add everything up, Mrs. Puff's estimated annual income is $154,200 legitimate earnings plus $195,000 shady earnings equals $349,200 annually. And of course, running her operation isn't cheap. Insurance premiums, $10,000 per year. Boat maintenance and replacements, $7,000 annually. Classroom repairs and utilities, $4,000 annually. Legal fees and fines, let's say $2,500 annually, total expenses $23,500 annually. Subtracting expenses, Mrs. Puff is left with $325,700 annually. That's a pretty solid income for someone who spends most of her time yelling at SpongeBob and dodging chaos. But remember, a big chunk of this comes from potentially illegal activities. So while the numbers look good on paper, the reality could be far more precarious if she ever gets caught. And there you have it. The curious case of Mrs. Puff's income is done, at least for now. But the mystery doesn't end here. If Mrs. Puff's earnings intrigued you, wait until you find out about the financial empire of Mr. Krabs. Click the video on your screen to find out the secrets of the Krusty Krab's fortune. See you there.